My parents hated me because I couldn't have kids, and they convinced my husband, Scott, that he deserved someone else. 3 years later, they were shocked to see me with a baby, and now they want a second chance. I'm 30 now, and I recently bumped into my parents and Scott, who's 33. It was the first time I'd seen them in almost 3 years, and I didn't know how to feel about it. We divorced 3 years ago, and I'd avoided seeing them since then because they had made my life miserable. After the divorce, I moved away to start fresh, far from everything that reminded me of my past. So, running into them again was very upsetting, and I said things that I'm not sure were the right choice. My parents always wanted a son. Growing up, they treated me okay, but I knew things would have been different if I had been a boy. My mom even said so a few times. I tried to stay in touch with my parents after college, even though they didn't seem to care much about keeping in contact. They were the only family I had since I wasn't close to my grandparents and had no aunts or uncles around. When I was 23, I started dating Scott, and suddenly my parents became more interested in my life. They called me more and asked about my relationship with Scott. I thought we were finally becoming a close family, so I didn't question their new interest. After dating Scott for 2 years, we got engaged and married. Things were good for a while, but 6 months into the marriage, my parents started pressuring us to have a baby. I was only 26 and wasn't ready, but after their constant pressure, Scott and I decided to try. After months without success, we got tested and found out that I couldn't have children. It was hard for us to accept, but it was even worse for my parents, who showed their disappointment without hiding it. When I told them, my dad walked out instead of comforting me. Scott and I decided to pause our plans for a family and consider IVF later, but it was expensive. While Scott and I accepted our situation, my parents became distant. They stopped visiting and talking to me, even when I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault. I finally called them out for their behavior, telling them they had been cruel just because I couldn't give them a grandchild. I told them to stay away from me, even though it was hard because I had always craved their approval. They didn't apologize. Instead, they told me I wasn't worth anything as a woman because I couldn't have kids. After that, I stopped talking to them. When I told Scott about the call, he was supportive at first, but soon his attitude changed. He became distant and cold, and within a few months, he brought home divorce papers. I tried to reason with him, but he said he didn't want to deal with our issues anymore. It took 7 painful months to finalize the divorce, and during that time, I learned that Scott had been living with my parents. It turned out they had been talking to him for months, likely convincing him to leave me because they thought he deserved someone else. After the divorce, I was devastated, but I focused on building a new life. I moved to the suburbs, got a new job, changed my appearance, and cut off all contact with my parents and Scott. I told my friends and relatives that I didn't want to hear anything about them anymore. For the past 3 years, I've been in therapy and doing pretty well, though I still wished for a child. Last year, I started IVF treatments and got pregnant with the help of an anonymous donor. 4 months ago, I had a baby girl, and I've been so happy since then. A few days ago, I was out walking with my baby when I ran into my parents and Scott. They were leaving a house nearby, and when they saw me, they approached me. They were surprised to see me with a baby, and Scott said he thought running into me was a sign that we should try to fix things between us. My parents wanted me to invite them over to catch up. I was shocked and angry that they even thought I would consider that after everything they put me through. I told them I'd rather invite wild animals into my home than them. I knew they only wanted to reconnect because I had a baby now. My parents suddenly cared because they wanted a grandchild, and Scott thought he could get back into my life since I had managed to have a child. It disgusted me that they only saw me as someone who could give them a baby, not as a person with feelings. They all abandoned me when I needed them most, and now they wanted back in. But I wasn't interested. For some twisted reason, my parents and Scott left me when I was at my lowest. I remembered every hurtful thing they said, so I repeated their words back to them. I reminded them that if I was such a worthless woman and Scott deserved better, they should just leave me alone now. I've always been a quiet and shy person, but when they confronted me on the street that day, I unleashed 3 years of pent-up anger. I yelled at them with everything I had. Once I was done, I rushed home and shut the door quickly. I felt awful afterward, so I decided to stay home from work for a few days with my baby. That confrontation kept replaying in my head, and I didn't know how to move on from it until last night, when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer calls like that, but for some reason, I did this time. It was Scott, and I could hear my parents whispering in the background, not even trying to hide that they were there. I tried not to let it bother me too much, and told Scott that I didn't want him to call me again, or I'd have to take legal action. I said the same applied to my parents. I wanted nothing to do with them. I only answered to let them know I was truly done, just like I had been 3 years ago. But Scott asked me to hear him out, and I didn't hang up. He admitted that he and my parents had made mistakes, saying their actions came from disappointment. They had really wanted to start a family, and when they found out I was infertile and unwilling to try IVF until we had saved more money, they didn't handle it well. Now, he asked me to give them another chance to be part of my life. After a few seconds, I told him I didn't believe what he was saying. They only cared because they saw me with a baby, and I was tired of them pretending otherwise. I was about to hang up when my parents jumped in, accusing me of being selfish, which is why they had cut me off. They claimed I had been too focused on my own pain when I found out I was infertile, instead of giving them space to deal with the news too. That, according to them, was why they distanced themselves from me, leaving me with no one. A lot of people asked why my parents didn't try for another child if they wanted a son so badly. My mom had complications during her pregnancy with me, and the doctor recommended waiting a few years before trying again. But by then, she was in her late 30s, which made pregnancy riskier. Like me, she struggled with fertility, but she faced criticism from her mother-in-law back then. In my case, it was my own mother who turned against me. That's why they only had me, a daughter. I don't know much about Scott's relationship with his parents, but from what I saw, they seemed close. He was an only child, and they treated him well. I don't know why he became so attached to my parents. They had always wanted a son, so their behavior towards Scott made sense, but I don't understand why he leaned into that relationship. I hadn't thought much about it, but now that people are asking, I feel like I need to talk to my ex-in-laws, even if it's just to satisfy my curiosity. I reached out to Scott's parents to understand why he got so close to mine. It was awkward since I hadn't spoken to them since the divorce, but they were kind and willing to talk. After some small talk, I asked about Scott's relationship with my parents. They said Scott had reconnected with them after a fight, but had also kept in touch with my parents. They told me Scott often went over to my parents' place for dinner, even when I wasn't there, believing it made him look good to them. My parents treated him like the son they never had, even giving him expensive gifts and money. He used this money to offer to pay for IVF, but he never told me the full story because he would have had to admit his close relationship with my parents. Eventually, my parents used this connection to convince Scott that he deserved someone better, leading to him leaving me. Scott's parents apologized, saying they disagreed with how things happened, but couldn't cut him off because he was their only child. I didn't blame them, they didn't owe me anything, and were just being honest. Now that I know the full story, I have no reason to let Scott or my parents back into my life. After nearly 2 weeks off, I finally returned to work. I still had time left on my maternity leave since I didn't use all 6 months at once. At home, my daughter was with her trusted nanny. During work, the nanny called me, saying she took my daughter to her place because Scott showed up at my house, causing a scene. She was worried for our safety and called the police while sneaking out with my daughter. When I got home, the police were already there, and Scott was clearly drunk. I decided to press charges and filed for a restraining order since he seemed out of control. After the police took him away, my nanny brought my daughter back. I gave her the rest of the day off since I planned to stay home. I may need to take a few more days off, but I don't mind because it means I get to spend more time with my daughter. It's been a few weeks since my last update. I've been busy taking care of my baby, and I've also started a new project that's been really exciting. Here's what's been going on with my parents and Scott. I managed to get a restraining order against Scott, which wasn't too hard since I had security footage from the day he showed up drunk and made a scene when he realized I wasn't home. The footage came from my neighbor, but they suggested I install my own cameras, which I plan to do. Sometimes I laugh thinking that Reddit might have a deal with camera companies because it's such common advice. My parents seem to have gotten the message and have kept their distance. My ex-in-laws told me that after what happened, they cut ties with Scott. Apparently, he's been struggling to find a new partner, even though he really wants to start a family. He's not interested in adoption, so that's made things harder for him. This might explain his recent behavior, but it doesn't mean I need to forgive him, especially after everything he put me through, along with my parents. They're still trying to spread rumors about me to other relatives, which is ironic because it's not working. Everyone knows they're the ones who did terrible things, and now they're trying to play the victims. That's not how it works, and they're finding out the hard way. I'm relieved they'll never be able to see their granddaughter. I'm not going to allow it. My daughter and I will live a happy life together without anyone interfering. I'm determined to be a better mom than the one I had as an example. This update is a bit wild, as it really shows my parents' true colors, though I think we all kind of saw this coming. Until now, they hadn't reached out to me since they were blocked everywhere, and they were apparently too embarrassed to come to my houses. Clearly, Scott didn't feel that same shame, considering everything he did. By the way, I haven't heard from him lately, and the restraining order seems to be working so far. But last week, my parents showed up at my house again. I waited a bit before sharing this, just to see if they'd try anything else. When I opened the door to tell them to leave, they said they just wanted to meet my son. Yes, they called my daughter a son. They had only seen her once by chance, and I don't usually dress her in pink or overly girly clothes. She mostly wears neutral colors because she's a baby. She does have some pink outfits, but I'm not the type to dress her entirely in pink. So, my parents just assumed she was a boy, even though she wasn't dressed like one. My daughter is still just a few months old, so you can't really tell by her face whether she's a girl or a boy. When they said, "son," I corrected them, letting them know she was actually my daughter. They looked confused, as if their whole idea of her had been shattered. They told me they were too ashamed to reach out before, but now wanted to meet their grandson again, referring to her as a boy. This time, I didn't correct them because I started to see what was going on. They kept talking about how they'd cut ties with Scott after his behavior, and that they wanted to fix things with me. They even asked if the baby was home so they could see her, and brought some gifts, boy toys, and light blue clothes. They left the gifts at my door when they left, and now I'm not sure what to do with them. I'll probably donate them or give them to a friend who has a son. Before they left, I asked if they truly wanted to meet my daughter, emphasizing that she's a girl. not a boy. My mom responded, but she wasn't dressed in pink the other day. I explained to them what I've mentioned here. After that, they said they'd still like to meet her, but I could hear the hesitation in their voices. I told them she was sleeping and suggested they could come back in a few hours when she'd be up for feeding. They said they would, but I haven't heard from them since. I think they only pretended to want to meet her because the situation was awkward, and once they found out she was a girl, they lost interest. Honestly, I wasn't serious about introducing them to her, and I don't want them in her life anyway. Deep down, I expected this kind of reaction, so it didn't surprise me. Almost 2 months have passed since this happened, and no, I haven't heard from my parents. I guess I was right.